So I want to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Most of you have read the description, and you know Laura Ebke from Nebraska. Laura is a Nebraska native. She was elected to the unicameral legislature in 2014 as a Republican, but switched from the Republican Party to the Libertarian Party in 2016. She did so as a result of the governor constantly browbeating her for the fact that she wasn't sticking to the party line of the Republicans. It's difficult for libertarians to do that. So, welcome. Just a couple of things. You notice there were a few people who were disappointed that she wasn't able to make it to the gathering last night. There is an explanation for that. She got in a little later. She didn't get here till a little later because she's in Colorado, so she had to stop at a dispensary, and it took a little longer than she had anticipated. So when she was walking down here earlier, she was having a difficult time, and I said, something wrong with your knees there? She said, yeah, my joints are a little stiff. I said, you're just rolling them too tight. You'll be fine. But she told me a story that I wanted to relay to you. In Nebraska, they have a Republican Appreciation Day, where they browbeat all the lobbyists, thank you. They browbeat the lobbyists and raise some money, and they do the same thing for the Democrats. And so then, now there's this libertarians, what do we do? So they did a Appreciate Your Libertarian, and did a fundraiser and managed to raise about $10,000. So those of you who are concerned about the economics of the Libertarian Party, become a candidate, get elected, and apparently they just give us money. So then we're not growing simply because we just don't have lobbyists throwing money at us, so maybe if we just get elected. Anyway, without further ado, I would like to introduce the keynote speaker for today, State Senator from Nebraska, Laura Ebke.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me back to Colorado. I was here last year and very much enjoyed my time with you. That was my first foray into Libertarian Party conventions as a Libertarian. I had participated in the Nebraska Libertarian Party convention about 2 months before I made the switch. And if any of you know Ben Backus, he was critical in getting me to move that way. Ben is, by the way, a city councilman in Gering. He was elected in 2016, so as a Libertarian, so that's a good thing for Nebraska. You heard a little bit. I'm not going to bore you with the details of why I made the switch and how I became a Libertarian, my whole sordid political history. But if you want to hear more about that later, I'm always happy to share. So they asked if I would talk a little bit today about building relationships beyond partisan politics. And that's something that seems a little bit weird to talk about, I think, especially when you start looking at the current state of political discourse today. In many ways, I think that we are more polarized perhaps than we've ever been in at least modern history. But I do think that it's possible to work outside of party lines if you're willing to do the work necessary. So the first thing I need to tell you, as much as we libertarians may disagree about what a real libertarian is, we don't ever disagree about that, or do we? There are a lot more people out there who think that our general way of looking at things is really alien. You need to understand that if you're going to find a way to work with people outside of the Libertarian Party. And why would we want to work with them? I mean, they're statists of some variety, right? Why would we want to work with them? Well, here's a very simple reason. There are a lot more of them, both Republicans, Democrats, and nonpartisans, than there are of us right now. And if we want to move the needle of liberty a little bit, we need to find friends who will work with us, at least on some things. Now, I may have it somewhat easier. I live in Nebraska, and we've got this freakish political system of a legislature. We only have one house, It's made of 49 members. They call us senators, and we have term limits. 2 4-year terms, and then you have to sit out for at least 4 years before you can come back. And the third thing to remember is that we are officially nonpartisan. In other words, on the ballot, there is no actual indication of party affiliation, which is not to say that parties don't get involved, because they absolutely positively do. And I will tell you stories about that later if you want to hear them too. So I want to tell you a few stories about how people, Republicans, Democrats, and yes, Libertarians, can actually work together against the odds to achieve important public policy goals. First up, we were talking about this at lunch a little while ago, the death penalty repeal in Nebraska. Now, Nebraska's had a death penalty on the books forever, and in the late 90s they switched from the electric chair to the lethal injection by statute. Okay, so that's the only way you can put somebody to death, is by lethal injection now. And Nebraska has not had an execution since 1998. When I was running, I really didn't think that the death penalty was something that was going to come up. Nobody asked me about it out on the streets as I was running, and I just didn't talk about it. There had been no real effort to make the death penalty happen in the state. And the one time that I was asked was on a questionnaire by the Nebraska Catholic Conference. And they asked, if I would vote to repeal the death penalty, and I said, well, sure. I thought that it was a bad policy for the state to kill people who were already incarcerated and not a danger to larger society. And so that was a good thing. And then I was sitting on the Judiciary Committee after I'd gotten elected, and a death penalty repeal bill came before us. Oh goodness. That was certainly an interesting experience during that session. Now, the senator who introduced it, he is another freak of political politics, and I say that in a nice way. Senator Ernie Chambers. If you ever want to know about Senator Chambers, just Google Ernie Chambers. He's the longest serving Nebraska state legislator ever. He is the reason why we now have term limits, okay? So he was term limited out, and then he sat out for 4 years and he came back. He spent something like 42 years in the Nebraska legislatures beginning in the 70s. And he's introduced death penalty repeal bills just about all the time, just about every session since he's been in the legislature. And he does it just because, not because he actually thinks it's going to go anywhere. But we had some sort of a strange situation happen in 2015. There was a group of us, more conservative types, if you will. I was still a Republican at the time, and that's how the news people at least classified me, who joined forces with the more progressive types, and we ended up not only moving the bill out of committee, but also enacting it into law. And we overrode the governor's veto. That's what really made him mad. Conservatives concerned about the death penalty and the ACLU of Nebraska, as well as a few other groups across the political spectrum, had worked together to make this happen. And I think that kind of cooperation is really not all that common. Doesn't happen a lot in Lincoln anyhow. And what we saw there was we saw a groups of people who came to the same conclusion, sometimes for different reasons. And that's something that we should maybe perhaps embrace as libertarians. Work with people who can come to the same conclusion as we do, even if we don't come to those conclusions for the same reason. Now, that cooperation doesn't happen all that often, but in my experience, when it does happen, it almost always happens because somebody who has at least some libertarian leanings, if not actually a libertarian, is there helping to bridge the gap. A second example in Nebraska comes from 2016. A good friend of mine in the legislature, who I think might have actually made the switch with me to the Libertarian Party eventually, if he had not been defeated for re-election in 2016. He introduced a civil asset forfeiture repeal bill. Now, the template for that bill came from the Institute for Justice, who do very good libertarian public policy work. He championed the bill. It came to the Judiciary Committee, which I still sat on, and I had co-sponsored the bill. I was the only co-sponsor, and I helped to move it out of committee and onto the floor. Now, we weren't really sure it was going to go very well. It was opposed by law enforcement. Imagine that. They were getting the fruits of the forfeiture. They objected to it. The Attorney General objected to it. The county attorneys objected to it. The county sheriffs objected to it. Pretty much everybody in the law enforcement arena objected to it. But we got it onto the floor, and again, the Institute for Justice was involved. They had written the kind of model legislation for him, and the ACLU of Nebraska was a great partner as well. And as we worked the bill on the floor, we again found an interesting group of people rallying to the bill. There had been a case in Seward, Nebraska, along the interstate, of a traveling missionary from Central America who was in Nebraska, visiting churches around the state, who was collecting offerings to take back to his mission work in Central America, and he was pulled over, and they found this big stash of cash in his trunk, and they just assumed that it was ill-gotten gains. Eventually, the ACLU of Nebraska won that, and he got his money back, but it took about a year and a half. So the ACLU was on board, but even so, because of the nature of the person who had money taken, we were able to peel off enough kind of conservative Republican votes as well. And of course, the progressives just generally didn't like civil asset forfeiture for more civil libertarian reasons. We passed the bill, and although the governor had expressed some displeasure, he didn't veto it, and it did become law in Nebraska, although unfortunately some Trump administration policies have watered it down some again. One last story I want to tell you about, and the end of this story has not been written yet, because we're still negotiating. Legislative Bill 299. This is a bill that is fairly significant occupational licensing reform in Nebraska. I introduced model legislation for the Institute for Justice. The bill has undergone some significant changes in the last year and a half since we've been working on it, but key components remain. First, this notion that second chances for those who have a criminal conviction on their record, that there be some sort of nexus, if you will, between the criminal record and denial or limitation of licensure, rather than what we sometimes find in statute in terms of kind of broad moral turpitude clauses that say if you've got a record, you can't be licensed. Second, a review regularly of all of our licenses and licensing boards. That's something that's been a real problem. And in fact, as I was negotiating with some union members the other day, the electricians union, they said, well, why do we have to have a legislative oversight of this? Can't the boards just review themselves and then submit the review to the legislature? No, that wouldn't be appropriate. That's not at all the not at all the goal. The goal is for the legislature to conduct an ongoing overview. And then third, we articulate a policy of least restrictive means of regulation, consistent with public health, safety, and welfare for occupations generally. Now, for you and me, most any regulation may seem to be too restrictive, right? But this would mark a substantial shift in policy for most state entities. So we started slowly gathering allies. First, I got some of the more free market-loving colleagues in the legislature to sign on to the bill. Mostly these were people who were part of my class of state legislators who had something of a streak of independence when it came to the governor. Yeah. And they had been called out as well, so they were willing to sign on to the bill. The next colleagues that we got, the ally that we got, was the Platt Institute. Now, the Platt Institute is an economic think tank based in Nebraska, based on free market principles. It was, ironically, founded by the current governor. But since his assumption to office, they've been playing things pretty straight and tried to stay true to the founding principles. He has divested himself of any interest there. He's not on their board or anything anymore. And they were the first to hear about my bill, and they adopted it as sort of one of their bills to watch in the 2017 legislative session. As we hit some resistance in the committee process, though, they became very vocal advocates for it and ultimately took it on as one of their priority legislation pieces for the session that we're in now. They liked it, obviously, for the limits it placed on the regulatory environment that we had in Nebraska. Now, the ACLU had done some research around the country on how tough it was for individuals with criminal records to get good jobs once they got out, because the number of licenses that many states have, which exclude those with any kind of criminal record. So they jumped on the effort as well. So now I have the very right-leaning Platt Institute and the left-ish leaning ACLU of Nebraska on board. Then we also managed to get, in addition to the Institute for Justice, the more progressive social justice type Nebraska Appleseed Group got involved at a somewhat lesser level as well. Some for the same reasons as the ACLU, but also I think because they realized the potential inequity in some of the licensing schemes which serve to keep people out of the system. So anyway, we have this coalition of folks who are working together on the bill. And we get the bill after a lot of amendments, after trying to make the committee happy over the summer when we're during the interim period, after about 10 different amendments. We finally get a white copy. That's sort of a replacement version copy of the bill that we had originally introduced. We thought we got rid of all of the fiscal note, which I'll talk about here in a minute, and that it wasn't going to cost the state anything, that it was going to create a great process, and we got the committee to push it out onto the floor. I designated it as my priority legislation for the year, and priority legislation in Nebraska, every senator gets one priority legislation, so when we run out of time, the speaker pushes those priority bills up to the top. So, so that was my personal priority. So, first round of debate took place on February 20th, I believe. And because of the rules, and because I was sort of surprised by, I got a little bit waylaid by some folks, it turned out into what it was essentially a 3-hour semi-filibuster. And it came off the schedule without a vote. We got to lunchtime, we adjourned, and the speaker didn't bring it back. And my challenge then was to try to figure out how to get it back. It wasn't dead. It hadn't been, we hadn't lost it completely, but we needed to figure out how to get it back. And in order to do that, the speaker's rules are, when you've had extended debate like that you have to show them that you have the votes to defeat a filibuster and invoke cloture. So in Nebraska, that's a 2/3 majority. It means I had to go out and find 33 votes to prove that we could do that if I needed to. So I went out and talked first to the people who had actually opposed it on the floor. First, there were a couple of senators who are tied pretty closely to Health and Human Services. We needed to figure out a way, from their perspective, to dovetail this process with the Nebraska Uniform Credentialing Act for healthcare in order for them to buy in. So we spent a lot of time, lots of time, okay, going through line by line with those senators over the last month, how we were going to figure out how we could ease those concerns. Now, these are both what I will call moderately progressive Democrats. And so we sat down across the table and literally went down through the bill, line by line by line. What can you live with? What can't you live with on both sides of things? We got to the point where we could both live with it. Now, the attorneys in the drafting office know my office very well these days, because we have taken more versions of this bill to them to amend than probably any bill has gone through this year. They've probably worked through 20 plus amendments for us over the course of the last month. There were a few people who were concerned, and I will call them very conservative Republicans, about the process of sunrising licenses that was originally in the bill. Once we understood their concerns, although I'd like to see a deeper dive analysis done before we create new licenses. In fact, I generally prefer not to create any new licenses. Those objections made some sense from a process concern. How are you going to, in the middle of a legislative session, how are you going to do this full-fledged analysis with no more staff, with nobody else to do the research? Because what we had suggested was that, they were supposed to analyze all the fiscal impacts, all the economic growth impacts, and so forth. So I was able to determine eventually that we had enough votes to invoke cloture, or at least enough votes that I could convince the speaker that we'd be able to if it was necessary. And he put us back on the schedule a couple weeks ago. After about a 25-minute debate, we went to a vote, and it passed 31-0 with 11 people not voting. So, passed the first round, which was a big deal for us. We still had some people who were a little bit concerned, but they weren't willing to filibuster it, and they were willing to work with me on the next round of debate. We have 3 rounds in Nebraska. So we've made a few more changes to the process, and then thought we had it all worked out. The unions were concerned about some stuff, and we fixed the things with the unions, we thought. And then 2 days ago, the fiscal office dropped a bomb on us. And they decided, gosh, if you're going to do this, it's going to take more staff, and it's going to cost about $102,000 a year. And so I spent yesterday, before I was able to leave after we left session, I spent yesterday actually going through the whole bill and talking with the executive board and with the executive board's legal counsel, trying to explain what we were doing and how it was actually not going to cost $102,000 to see if we could get some sort of an effort to fix the fiscal note, because in our current financial environment in Nebraska, fiscal note is the kiss of death. And I had never actually introduced a bill that had a fiscal impact before, so this was totally new to me. So, I think we've got it figured out. We'll have another amendment on Monday. Hopefully, later this week we'll be on select file, which is the second round of voting, and we'll have all of these things worked out. My point in all of this is to say simply this. It is possible to move beyond partisan politics. It is possible to forge consensus and compromise that will move us in the direction of more liberty. But it's really hard work, and it takes an honest willingness to compromise. It takes a willingness to understand that, even though this is my ideal, I may not get all of what I want, but if I can move in the right direction, that's a net gain. So I want to talk for just a couple more minutes, and then, check my time here. Okay, I'm going to talk for just a couple more minutes about how we advance liberty. And how we can be libertarians, how we as libertarians can play the political game and move the needle in the right direction. So, libertarians are, you all are, to my unbiased eyes, really, really, really smart, okay? And you're also really, really, really idealistic. And you know what? We libertarians like to let people know that. There's this movie image, and I don't know what the movie was, I just have this memory of a conversation in this movie about, and a couple of characters are talking about philosophy, right? And someone mentions the German philosopher Schopenhauer. And the other character says, Schopenhauer. That's all. Just says that in a very knowing way. And everybody else that's seated around just kind of stares blankly like, what is that? And that's really kind of the feeling that people outside of libertarian circles get when they stumble into a gaggle, is that what we are? I don't know, of libertarians. You may have read the libertarian canon, whether it's Bastiat, Hayek, or whoever else is on the list these days, but they probably haven't, okay? And their eyes glaze over, okay? People in the real world don't really care that much about the great philosophers. I come from the Republican Party where they were, ostensibly conservative. I've never once seen a conservative Republican quote Edmund Burke, ever, okay? What people really care about are simple ideas put simply. And that's the challenge of the Libertarian Party, I think, today and in the coming years. Somehow we've got to make the principles of liberty accessible to the broader public. And we've got to do it without scaring them away. So, when you enter into public office, and I was on a school board for 12 years before I went to the legislature. But when you enter public office, you realize that you live in a world that's a little bit different than most libertarians do. And I found that to be the case as I've traveled around to Michigan and Indiana and Kansas and South Dakota and assorted other places for some of their conventions. You know, I don't live in a world where we can start from scratch or blow the whole system up. You know, no matter how much we'd like to do that, I live in a world where people have certain expectations, you know, of government building roads, sorry, and providing schools, sorry. I live in a world where it's assumed that the government will license professions, sorry, and will protect children from abusive parents. I don't know, I'm not so sorry. I live in a world where people expect law enforcement to protect them, okay, and the state to punish those who violate them. You know, I live in a world not of a couple of hundred of my best friends and ideological soulmates getting together to create our own society or new Facebook groups, but I live rather in a diverse society where political philosophy spans the spectrum from near anarchist to near pure collectivist. Okay? We're all over the place as a society. We are a microcosm of that society. So how do we move in the direction of more liberty? I think we need to think incrementally. We have to do for libertarian ideas what progressives have done for their version of the world, arguably since the beginning. Okay? We are on a number line. Think of it that way. We're on a number line that stretches into infinity in both directions. Pure liberty is at one end. Remember, that's an infinity. And pure collectivism or statism is at the other end. It doesn't really matter where you say we're on today. What matters is the direction that we're pointed in. So you say you want more liberty. Don't expect it to happen overnight. Don't expect a libertarian savior. Every political decision we make should revolve around this, in my view. Okay? I have to say that as a libertarian, right? I have to say, it's just my opinion. But will it move the liberty movement in the right direction so that we can say we moved a step toward liberty? Or will it move the liberty movement backwards? Everything we do ought to be focused on that. And sometimes we'll guess wrong. Sometimes we'll move in the wrong direction accidentally. But I would argue that our goal as a party, in every decision, every public comment, every legislation supported or opposed, every candidate we run, should be at least to do no harm to liberty. And optimally, we should move us, even by the smallest of margins, in the right direction. So during the 2017 legislative session, there was a week when we had several big bills that had to do with assorted things related to taxes and spending and so forth. And the first was a tax reform bill. It would have provided some marginal property tax relief. Our property taxes are crazy in Nebraska and are used to fund our schools. And would have reduced, beginning in a couple of years, the income tax rate for all taxpayers. Okay? The usual suspects, of course, got upset. Tax cuts for the wealthy. That was the big thing that we heard. And they sent out these really nicely done graphics that showed that someone making $500,000 a year would get more money back than someone making $50,000 a year. Never mind that those making $500,000 a year are already paying a lot more, right? And that if you cut the taxes of everyone in our relatively flat income tax structure in Nebraska by 1%, yes, those who pay more will get more back. Math is funny that way. So at the end of one day, I had sent my staff home and was just getting the last of my things together, and my office phone rang. That was my first mistake. I answered the phone. Okay, I don't usually do that after hours, but I did. And a constituent wanted to argue with me about tax cuts. Thought that the rich ought to pay a higher percentage and all that sort of stuff. And I listened for a while, and then I asked a very simple question. I thought, what do you think is a fair amount to take away from these people? I thought that was reasonable. I was late. And first she said, well, they don't need 20 houses. I said, okay, they don't need 20 houses. I said, fine, but what's a fair percentage of their income for the state to take from someone? And her response, you'll like this, you're not taking it from them if it's taxes. Now remember, I'm a new libertarian at the time. And the things that were going through my head that I wanted to say, but I didn't. It wouldn't have been productive for me to say, well, taxation is theft. And it would have set me up for another 30 or 40 or 50 or 2-hour conversation that I really didn't want to have and really wanted to go home. So instead I just said, well, we'll probably have to disagree on what appropriate tax policy is. And I wished her a nice day, hung up, and just shook my head all the way out to my car. Politics is a long game, folks. It's not one hand. If it's played right, it's much more like a multi-dimensional chess game, the ones that you see in Star Trek and such. We need to be able to look ahead. We need to be strategic. We need to see what the results of our actions will do for our end goal. Will demanding all or nothing win people over to our side? I don't know. Will saying taxation is theft ingratiate us to those government trusters on both the left and the right? Or will it put up their defenses? Will saying that we don't need government to build the roads really help our cause when the paradigm says that the government must be the planners of infrastructure? We can talk about these things internally. We can toss things out from time to time. But we still have to live in the real world, I think. So if you want to really, make more liberty, I would challenge you to do a couple of things. First, get off of Facebook and stop expecting perfection in other libertarians. Look at the end game. More liberty for our kids and our grandkids than we have. And I was one of those crazy people who kind of liked the Johnson-Weld team, okay? Might you throw things at me? Not because they were perfect libertarians, and indeed I'm really not sure what that is, but because of what they represented. These were two former governors who were actually willing to associate with the Libertarian Party. Two former governors who understood what a real campaign looks like. Two former governors who had real governing experience that could lend credibility to the cause. Two former governors who understood how to raise money. So if we really want to grow liberty, we need the Libertarian Party, I think, to be seen as people who can actually be responsible at governing, not as gadflies. We do that by running people for city councils and mayors and school boards and county boards and state legislative assemblies and whatever else you've got in your state. And then when they've developed a reputation for competent, principled leadership, you run them for the next level up. Okay? And to get people elected to those positions, we've got to do what the old parties have done for 100 years. Okay? We need to recruit credible candidates who are libertarians. We need to raise money for them. We need to knock on doors with them. We need to provide them with the resources that they need, and we need to encourage them to make the best decisions for less government that they can without putting their credibility at risk. And we hold them accountable, okay? But we don't do like a certain governor in Nebraska did, okay? And we don't do it in a public way. You hold them accountable without alienating them. Because you don't want to blow up their credibility as libertarians by telling them that this is a very unlibertarian thing to do. Get your state chair to go and talk to them and say, you might not want to do that again. All sorts of things like that. And once you've figured out how to do that, you rinse, you repeat, and you do it over and over and over again for as long as it takes. I believe, I'm a political scientist by training, and I believe that the old party foundations are cracking up right now. They're becoming increasingly exclusionary. People who were once welcome in one or both of those parties are becoming increasingly unwelcome. Some are becoming independents or nonpartisans. Some are looking at us. And we need to offer that third way, a third rational way. We need to play the long game We need to run for someone for president? Yeah, sure. But until we have proven that we can elect libertarians to state legislatures and governorships and to Congress, don't expect miracles. But we can help build our foundation. Build your local parties up, register voters, elect local officials, help bulk up your state party so that they can help local candidates to win, register more voters, and then elect some state officials. We need to show, I think, that we're not only principled, but also that we can be big tent principled. That's the only way we win. That anyone who believes in less government and more freedom is welcome. And then, in 20 or 30 or 50 years, once we get some real political clout, then we can start fighting with one another about who is the real libertarian. I'm going to tell you this. You need to take joy in the baby steps for liberty. Be willing to take a few more baby steps for liberty. Understand that not every move is going to be the winning move. Not every move is going to totally change the world as we know it. Understand that not everyone is going to jump in line with us, no matter how rational our argument is. But understand as well that sometimes you've got to move in a way that positions you to make a big move in the right direction later. I want to thank you all for being here. I believe that the people that come to these conventions are the vanguard for the long fight for liberty. Keep at it. Thanks for inviting me, and if you've got any questions, we might have 5 minutes. Sorry. Thank you for being here for me today. Okay, so I got a little nodding after that. Thank you.